This is Investment Perspectives with Brad Kimes, daily live streaming interactive, featuring Mrs. Backup. Subscribe, hit the notification, smash the likes. Now, here's Backup Brad Kimes. Come on in.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to Investment Perspectives, everybody. Got two pieces of information I want to touch on today. One is the Federal Reserve kicks the FedWire's ISO20022 can down the road. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about after this is the digital ID workup paperwork PDF file that has come from the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, regulatory body connected to the G20. Now, this gets a little exciting because we're looking at two different pieces of information, but at the same time, one saying there's a delay, and then the other one is really just showing how much effort and how much thought process and dialoguing going on behind the scenes has been taking place for them to even reach such a consensus about digital ID itself. So let's start with this first piece and temper everything that we get here while we do it. So Federal Reserve kicks the ISO 20022 down the road. The Federal Reserve has announced it will not implement phase one of the FedWire Fund Services migration to ISO 20022 during 2020 or 2021. It confirms that it does not have any other message format changes planned through 2021. Little disappointing right there, but let's just keep going for a second here. In September 2019, the Federal Reserve, the Fed, announced its plans to delay and reassess a phased implementation strategy in favor of a single-day implementation known as a Big Bang approach, also being taken in Europe. Now, this refers, I believe, to the Big Bang cutover that Victoria Cleland had spoke about, executive director from the Bank of England, a year or two ago. The Fed notes the discussions around this change have considered cross-border interoperability issues that may occur if the Federal Reserve banks and other high-value payment systems operators have not implemented the ISO 20022 messaging standards by the time SWIFT enables its participants to start sending data-rich ISO 20022 messages over its global network. The Fed adds that the discussions have also addressed the impact over SWIFT's decision to delay its migration to the new messaging standard by 12 months to November 2022, with the ECB having to step in and enforce measures to mitigate the delay's impact. SWIFT's delay has caused widespread unease across the European banking landscape, with multiple institutions, associations calling on the ECB to push back various projects and programs, such as the T2, T2S consolidations. Due to the timeline and strategic disruptions caused by SWIFT's decision, the Federal Reserve says given the pandemic, it is unlikely that we will announce a final decision on the ISO migration strategy before the end of this year. The Fed adds that it remains committed to supporting the ISO standard and anticipates providing an update regarding the overall migration plan for the FedWire Fund Services later in 2020. Okay, so it says it's not planning to do any of that, and then it says down here, unlikely they will announce a final decision on the ISO 20022 migration strategy before the end of this year. So, the tentative discussion is to delay it at least a year. And then down here, they're going to give a final decision closer to the end of this year. I have to say, maybe this is accurate. Maybe this is what they do, and they do push this back. I don't know, though. I have to say, not to fly in the face of an article here, and I like Finextra. They put out great content, and I think they're just telling us what they're being told as well. But I would just remark to everyone, and I'm an eternal optimist, that head on a swivel. A lot of this stuff is watch the right hand and do something with the left hand. Maybe it does happen. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe they do kick the can down the road. However, I do feel like this is something to keep a very close eye on to where we get closer to the end of the year and see what they actually choose to do. So just keep that in mind. Okay. And ultimately, they're doing it, right? I mean, ultimately, it's going to happen, whether it happens, this year or in a year or more from now, we'll have to see. Okay, let's go on to the next piece of information, which is the FATF, regulatory body connected to the G20, which is, by the way, getting ready to reach their first year deadline on the first wave of requirements that they put out for KYC for all the exchanges in the crypto space. And that will be coming out, I believe the deadline for that is June 21st, if my memory serves me correctly. So it'll be interesting to see how the countries respond to that first year deadline on that KYC AML guidelines for exchanges. Right now, we're looking at another wave of guidelines that are out, and this is on digital identity from the Financial Action Task Force, March of 2020. So just 2 months ago here. And basically, we're going to just overskim this thing a little bit here, and let's go down to, and matter of fact, let me show you the table of contents, and I will provide this PDF in the comment section so you all can take a look at it. There is a lot of information here, and you should check it out. So, okay. All right. So digital terminology, key features, FATF standards, customer due diligence, benefits and risk of digital ID systems for AML, CFT compliance and related issues. Assessing whether digital ID systems are sufficiently reliable and independent under a risk-based approach to CDD. Okay, and then description of basic digital identity systems and its participants, case studies, principles on identification and sustainable development, and digital ID assurance, assurance framework and technical standard setting bodies. And then there's an overview of U.S. and EU digital assurance frameworks and technical standards. Now let's go down here to the executive summary because it's going to give you a really, really nice overview of what's covered here. Now just listen to these numbers in the first sentence or two. The digital payments are growing at an estimated 12.7% annually and are forecast to reach 726 billion transactions annually by 2020. By 2022, an estimated 60% of the world's GDP will be digitalized. For the FATF, the growth in digital financial transactions requires a better understanding of how individuals are better identified and verified in the world of digital financial services. Digital identity, known as ID, technologies are evolving rapidly, giving rise to a variety of digital ID systems. The guidance is intended to assist governments, regulated entities, and other relevant stakeholders in determining how digital ID systems can be used to conduct certain elements of customer due diligence under the FATF recommendation. And let's see, an understanding of how digital ID systems work is essentially to apply the risk-based approach recommended in this guidance. Section 2 of the guidance briefly summarizes the key features of digital ID systems that are explained in detail in Appendix A. Section 3 summarizes the main FATF requirements addressed in this guidance, including the requirements to identify and verify customers, identities using reliable independent source documents, data or information in the digital ID context, and the requirement that digital source documents, data, information must be reliable, independent, means that the digital ID system used to conduct CDD relies upon technology, adequate governance, processes and procedures that provide appropriate levels of confidence that the system produces accurate results. The guidance clarifies that non-face-to-face customer identification and transactions that rely on reliable, independent digital ID systems with appropriate risk mitigation measures in place may present a standard level of risk and may even be a lower risk. The risk-based approach recommended by this guidance relies on a set of open source consensus driven by assurance frameworks and technical standards for digital ID systems, referred to as digital ID assurance frameworks and standards, that they have been developed in several jurisdictions, the International Organization of Standards, the ISO, together with the International Electrotechnical Commission, known as the IEC, throughout this document. IEC is standardizing these digital assurance frameworks and updating a range of ISO IEC technical standards relating to identity, information technology, security, privacy to develop comprehensive global standard for digital ID systems. Now listen here when we get down the line here a minute. An identity assurance framework sets requirements for different assurance levels of assurance level measures, and the level of confidence in the reliability of independence of a digital ID system and its components. While the assurance levels developed by various jurisdictions may vary in certain respects, for ease of reference, this guidance primarily refers to the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST. Now, let me just say this. Well, let me finish reading this section now, and then we'll do it. Okay, so Digital ID Assurance Framework and Standards, and the EU's and IDA's regulations jurisdictions should consider the approach set out of the guidance in line with their domestic digital ID assurance frameworks and other relevant technical standards. Okay, so now it does go on here and talk about digital ID assurance frameworks and standards, AML, CFT regulations, different origins, intended audiences. The guidance draws links between digital ID assurance frameworks and standards and the FATF CDD requirements. As illustrated in the table below, the key components of a digital ID system are relevant to specific identification and verification requirements under Recommendation 10. Accordingly, the digital ID assurance frameworks and technical standards which define these components and set requirements for assurance levels provide a highly useful tool for assessing reliability, independence of digital systems for AML and CFT purposes. Now, I'm not going to read any more. You can go ahead and take a sigh of relief. But what I want to talk about here, one is you see the depth of the verbiage here, right? What has been going on behind the scenes that we're not even made aware of. The other thing I want to show you here is this. The U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST. NIST, recently I did a video where I covered NIST and how they checked. It was Ethereum, R3, and one other network operating system, and basically R3 won the day and by flying colors with NIST and the test that they use. NIST is a outside of the government, but a entity that researches technological advances and innovation. Normally speaking, generally speaking, whatever passes their test can be considered for government adoption. R3 definitely passed that test. Now, coming back to this document, knowing that the FATF is an international regulatory body, you are seeing a convergence here where NIST, a U.S. domestic, and it's not a government entity, but research facility or entity that really does go over all of the innovation that comes out in technology and really kind of puts it through the sniff test and whether it can pass the requirements that are really required for governmental use. When you see these different bodies like this working together, I think it's another sign of that, what we call a trend, where we see the international level, everything comes from above and runs down, internationally to domestic. And the reason that is because of this kind of cooperation that goes on while they're doing the work. They involve the EU, they involve the US and these different entities to go over this information and really hammer out a framework that is defined enough that you can use it, but loose enough that you can still define it for your respective country. So this is, to me, is exciting. I know digital ID, to a lot of people, they start getting the tinfoil hat. They get very cynical. They think, oh, they want to put a microchip in my head or, a chip in my hand. I don't feel that way at this point. Obviously, I think you could go that way 30 years from now or what have you. And I know that there's people putting chips in their hand right now, and somebody will put a comment under the video. But the bigger point for me is that you, just like custody, right? This digital asset space is not going to evolve in just one area. If we are going to have a legitimate market where the world can truly use cryptocurrency and fiat money that is going to be made into a CBDC, hybrid retail, two-tier system, what have you, this is necessary. And to a great degree, we have somewhat of a digital identity now. It's just making it more clear, making it more relevant, and making it more defined and actually more protected, hopefully, to where you can choose whatever transaction you're doing or interaction you're doing online or through your phone or whatever it is. You should be able to decide what that receiver actually knows about you. And hopefully that is the end goal to all of this. All right, guys, don't forget, I'm going to put this PDF in the comments for you to look at. It's 100+ pages here, but it is worth the look. There is really, really great stuff in this that really breaks down. And if you wanted to ever understand what's happening that we don't get to see, it's a lot. Because you cannot come up with this kind of writing and on the fly. I mean, it is so detailed and is so thought out. You can see the level of expertise and oversight and things that they have brought together to get all in one place to be able to formulate such a thing to where they could have this work on an international level. All right, guys, that's going to do it for me. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe if you like the content. Please share it, and we'll catch you on the next one.